Professor Tawan's iridescent scales shimmered as he walked across the front of his classroom at the Galactic University of Applied History. The three moons of Centauri Prime cast their soft purple and blue light through the panoramic windows, creating dancing patterns on the polished floor. The classroom buzzed with the quiet sounds of various species settling into their places, some floating, others walking, and a few even crawling to their designated spots. Harin, a Centaurian student with crystalline appendages that caught and reflected light like prisms, sat attentively in the front row. Her transparent form shifted colors with each movement, a trait common to her species. She had always been fascinated by primitive civilizations, which had earned her a reputation as somewhat eccentric among her peers. Behind her, Jinho's environmental chamber hummed quietly. As a methane breather from Proxima, he required special accommodations, but that had never dampened his enthusiasm for learning. His tentacle-like appendages pressed against the clear walls of his chamber as he adjusted his position for a better view of the holoprojector. Su-min, the teaching assistant, moved with precise, geometric patterns, their silicon-based form making soft clicking sounds as they organized the day's presentation materials. Their crystalline structure contained complex patterns that served as both memory storage and processing units, making them particularly suited for handling the vast amounts of historical data required for the class. Before we begin today's lesson, Professor Tawan said, his voice carrying a slight metallic resonance characteristic of his species, "I want you all to understand something important." He paused, his scales shifting from their usual blue to a more serious shade of deep purple. What you're about to learn may challenge your understanding of what a species can endure and survive. The class murmured in response. A Jovian student in the back row extended their gas-based sensory tendrils in curiosity, while several others adjusted their universal translators to ensure they wouldn't miss a word. Computer, begin historical projection sequence Earth Alpha 1. Ta 1 commanded. The room darkened slightly as a three-dimensional image materialized in the center of the classroom. It showed a primitive Earth landscape, with two groups of humans facing each other across an open field. Harin's crystalline form flickered with surprise as she leaned forward. "Professor," she asked, her voice translating through the classroom systems with a musical quality, "are they not wearing any protective fields?" "No protective fields, no energy shields, not even basic radiation barriers," Taiwan confirmed. "What you're seeing is what humans call ancient warfare. Specifically, a battle from their medieval period." Jinho's tentacles writhed in his chamber, and his translator conveyed his disbelief. "But they're so close to each other. How did they survive the psychological trauma of such proximity during conflict?" Professor Tawan's scales shifted to a teaching pattern, a mixture of green and gold that indicated he was about to share particularly important information. "That's precisely what makes human military history so fascinating. Unlike most species in our galaxy, humans evolved as persistence predators. They didn't develop natural energy weapons or defensive fields. Instead, they relied on physical weapons, endurance, and something they call close combat." The hologram shifted to show two humans engaged in sword fighting. Several students recoiled, their various biological responses indicating distress. A Neptunian student's water core nearly froze in shock. "What you're seeing," Taiwan continued, "was common practice for thousands of years on Earth. Humans would engage in physical combat, often close enough to see their opponent's eyes. They developed complex systems of combat, created specialized weapons, and even turned it into an art form they called martial arts." Su-min stepped forward, their crystalline form refracting light as they added. "The historical records indicate that humans often celebrated these abilities in their early entertainment media. They viewed physical combat skills as admirable traits." The professor nodded, his scales rippling with agreement. "Correct. And this is just the beginning of our study. Over the next few sessions, we'll explore how humans progressed from these primitive battles to what they called modern warfare, concepts that many species find even more disturbing. Harin raised one of her crystalline appendages. Professor, is it true that humans continued these practices even after developing ranged weapons? An excellent question, Todd replied, his scales brightening. In fact, humans not only continued these practices but adapted them. They developed something called hand-to-hand combat training that remained part of their military preparation well into their space age. The classroom erupted in a chorus of translated exclamations and questions. Jinho's environmental chamber fogged slightly as his methane atmosphere swirled with agitation. But why? Once they had advanced weapons, why maintain primitive combat methods? Professor Tawan's scales shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. That, students, is one of the most fascinating aspects of human military history. They believed in being prepared for any situation. Their warriors, they called them soldiers, were trained to fight effectively even if all their technology failed. It's one of the reasons humans were able to survive and advance despite their relatively primitive beginning. As the class time drew to a close, Professor Tawan's scales returned to their normal hue. For next class, please review the materials on early human weapon development. And remember, while what we're studying may seem shocking, it's crucial for understanding how humans became the species they are today. Their history of warfare, while violent by our standards, shaped their resilience and innovation in ways that would eventually lead them to join our galactic community. The students began gathering their materials, their movements reflecting a mixture of fascination and unease. Harin's crystalline form sparkled with excitement as she stored her data crystals, while Jinho's tentacles moved in patterns indicating deep thought. As they left, Professor Tawan watched them with satisfaction. Their reactions were typical for first-time students of human military history. But he knew that by the end of the course, they would understand how this violent past had forged one of the most resilient and adaptable species in the known galaxy. The classroom fell into a deep silence as Professor Tawan activated the next set of holographic images. The three-dimensional display flickered to life, showing ancient human warriors clashing with metal weapons. Young Mi's bioluminescent skin immediately began pulsing with waves of distress, casting shifting patterns of light across her desk. These images are from what humans called the Battle of Hastings, Professor Tawan explained, his scales shifting to a darker shade of blue. Notice how the humans are using primitive tools they called swords and spears to engage in direct physical combat. Young Mi's distress patterns intensified, creating beautiful but alarming swirls of purple and green across her translucent skin. Several other students moved their seating units away from her, worried that her emotional display might affect their own biological systems. Keita raised one of his primary tentacles, the appendage writhing with obvious confusion. "Professor," he began, his translator converting his subsonic vibrations into standard galactic speech. "I don't understand. Why would they choose to fight at such close range? Surely they had developed some form of distance weapons by this point in their evolution." Professor Tawan's scales rippled thoughtfully before he responded. "That's just it, Keita. They didn't have the technology. Unlike most spacefaring species, humans didn't evolve with natural defensive or offensive capabilities. They had to develop everything through trial and error. And warfare was often their greatest teacher." The hologram shifted to show a close-up of two humans locked in sword combat. Several students emitted various signs of distress. A Venusian student's plasma core flickered erratically, while a crystalline being from Epsilon Eridani grew cloudy with anxiety. "Please observe," Tawan continued, "how the humans are using their primitive tools as extensions of their bodies. They developed complex systems of movement and combat that they passed down through generations." Young Mi finally managed to control her bioluminescence enough to speak. "But Professor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "how did they handle the psychological impact? The emotional trauma of being so close to their opponents?" The professor's scales shifted to a teaching pattern, a mixture of green and gold. "An excellent question. Humans, as we now know, evolved as pack hunters with remarkable psychological resilience. They developed cultural and social structures that helped them process these experiences. They even created special training programs to prepare their warriors for close combat. Kitez's tentacles twisted into what the class had learned was his thinking pattern. Is this why humans were able to advance so quickly compared to other species? Because they were constantly trying to find better ways to fight. Precisely, Ta-1 replied. The hologram changed again, showing the evolution of human weapons through various ages. Each new weapon, each new tactic, drove them to develop countermeasures. This cycle of innovation through conflict became a defining characteristic of their species. A student from the gas giants of Antares, their forms swirling with curiosity, raised an atmospheric tendril. But Professor, our historical records show that most species develop defensive capabilities first, then offensive ones. Humans seem to have done the opposite. Professor Ta-1's scales brightened with approval. Yes, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of human military development. They often created new ways to attack before figuring out how to defend against them. It's a pattern that repeats throughout their history. The hologram now showed a sequence of battles, each more sophisticated than the last. Young Mei had finally managed to control her bioluminescence, though she still emitted faint pulses of discomfort at particularly violent scenes. Notice, Ta-1 pointed out, how human warfare evolved from individual combat to coordinated group tactics. They developed something they called formations, organized patterns of movement that maximized their fighting effectiveness. Kitez's tentacles stretched toward the hologram in fascination. It's almost like a dance, he observed, but with lethal intent. That's a very insightful observation, the professor agreed. Many human cultures actually did combine combat training with dance and other artistic expressions. They saw beauty in the efficiency of movement, even when that movement was designed for warfare. The class watched as the holographic display showed various human combat formations, phalanxes, shield walls, cavalry charges. Each new image brought fresh waves of astonishment from the alien students. What you're seeing, Professor Ta-1 explained, is not just the development of warfare, but the evolution of human problem-solving. Each new tactic was a response to a challenge, each new weapon an answer to a question of survival. Young Mei had finally regained enough composure to raise her hand. Professor, did they ever consider that there might be better ways to resolve conflicts? Ways that didn't involve such intimate violence? Ta-1's scales shifted to a contemplative purple. Yes, they did. In fact, human history is full of philosophers and leaders who advocated for peaceful solutions, but their drive to prepare for conflict never fully disappeared. Even today, in our modern galactic society, human diplomatic vessels maintain combat training facilities. The professor paused the holographic display on an image of ancient human warriors standing in formation. For next class, we'll be discussing how humans transitioned from these primitive weapons to what they called gunpowder weapons. I must warn you, many students find that topic even more disturbing than today's lesson. As the class began to gather their materials, Kitez's tentacles formed one final question pattern. Professor, do you think we should be grateful that humans developed the way they did? Their violent past seems to have made them uniquely suited for protecting the galaxy. Professor Ta-1's scales shifted through a complex pattern of colors before settling on a warm gold. That Kita is a question that galactic historians still debate. What we can say is that human history, as violent as it was, produced a species that understands both the cost and value of peace better than most. The students filed out of the classroom, their various biological systems still processing what they had learned. Young Mei's skin had settled into a thoughtful pattern of soft blue pulses, while Kitez's tentacles moved in contemplative ways. They had begun to understand that human history, though shocking to their sensibilities, held important lessons for all species in the galaxy. Jiayun sat forward in her hover chair, all four of her eyes focused intently on the holographic display. Her upper eyes tracked the larger movements while her lower pair caught the small details, a survival trait from her species' evolution as precision hunters. The image before the class showed a human warrior covered in metal plates, sitting atop a large four-legged creature. Professor Taiwan manipulated the controls, and the hologram zoomed in to show the intricate details of what humans called plate armor. The metal sheets overlapped in complex patterns, protecting vital areas while still allowing movement. "What you're seeing," the professor explained, his scales shifting to an educational gold-green pattern, "is one of humanity's most significant military innovations, the knight in full armor." These warriors would train from childhood to master both their equipment and their mount, which humans called a horse. Jai Yun's eyes blinked in alternating pairs as she processed this information. "Professor," she asked, her translator converting her high-pitched native speech to standard galactic common, "are you saying they deliberately placed themselves on top of another living creature for combat?" "Exactly," Taiwan replied. The hologram shifted to show a line of mounted knights charging across a battlefield. The combination of trained warrior, protective armor, and mounted position created what was, for its time, the most powerful mobile fighting force on Earth. Dong Hyun's crystalline form clouded slightly with anxiety, creating swirling patterns within his transparent body. "But the psychological trauma," he whispered, his voice creating harmonic resonances in the classroom's translation system. "How did they maintain sanity with such intimate violence?" The professor's scales rippled thoughtfully. "Humans developed complex social and cultural systems to help their warriors cope. The concept of knighthood wasn't just about combat. It included codes of behavior, honor, and duty." The hologram changed again, this time showing a massive stone structure under attack. Huge machines hurled rocks through the air, while armies clashed at its base. Several students emitted various signs of distress at the sight. "This," Taiwan continued, "is what humans called a castle siege. Notice how they combine different types of warfare: direct combat, defensive structures, and siege weapons, all in one battle." Jai Yun's upper eyes widened while her lower ones narrowed in concentration. "Those structures, they built them just for warfare?" "Not exactly," the professor explained. "Castles served multiple purposes: military defense, political control, and social organization. Humans often lived their entire lives within or around these fortifications." Dong Hyun's crystalline structure had partially cleared, now showing interest despite his earlier discomfort. "It seems almost elegant," he admitted, "the way they integrated warfare into their architecture and social systems." Professor Taiwan nodded, his scales brightening. "Observe this next sequence," he said, adjusting the hologram. It now showed knights practicing combat in an enclosed area. They called this tournament training. It allowed warriors to maintain their skills during peaceful times and served as entertainment for their society. The class watched as the holographic knights demonstrated various combat techniques. Jai Yun's 4 eyes tracked every movement, her species' natural hunting instincts helping her appreciate the tactical aspects. "Notice how the armor evolved," Taiwan pointed out. Each new weapon development led to improvements in protection. This constant cycle of innovation shaped human military technology for centuries. A student from the methane seas of Neptune raised a gaseous tendril. "Professor, our historical records show most species developed ranged weapons before close combat ones. Why did humans invest so heavily in armor for direct combat?" "Another excellent observation," Taiwan replied, his scales showing approval. "Humans did have ranged weapons, bows, crossbows, and later early firearms. However, they found that heavily armored warriors could often survive these attacks long enough to engage in close combat, where they held the advantage." The hologram shifted to show a castle under construction. Workers moved stones, architects planned defenses, and soldiers patrolled half-finished walls. "This represents years, sometimes decades of work," the professor explained. Humans would spend generations building and improving these fortifications. Each castle was a lesson in engineering, architecture, and military strategy. Jai Yun raised her primary appendage. "The resources required must have been enormous. How did they justify such expenditure?" "Survival," Taiwan said simply. These fortifications often meant the difference between life and death for entire communities. They weren't just military installations, they were symbols of power, safety, and civilization. Dong Hyun's crystalline form had completely cleared now, showing his growing fascination. So these structures served as both weapons and shields, a perfect integration of offense and defense. Precisely, the professor agreed, and this duality typified much of human military development. Every advance in offensive capability led to defensive innovations, and vice versa. As the class session neared its end, Professor Ta-Won brought up one final hologram, a complete medieval battlefield with knights, castles, siege engines, and armies all in motion. "Before you leave today," he said, his scales shifting to a serious deep blue, "consider this. Everything you've seen represents just one brief period in human military history. Next class, we'll discuss how the development of gunpowder weapons changed warfare forever." Ji-Yun's 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she processed this information. The idea that this complex system of warfare was just one chapter in human military development seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Dong Hyun, his crystalline form now showing patterns of deep thought, spoke softly. "Perhaps," he said, "their intimate familiarity with violence is what made humans so committed to maintaining galactic peace." Professor Ta-Won's scales shifted to a pattern indicating agreement. "That insight," he said, "is exactly why we study this history. Understanding humanity's path to peace requires understanding their extensive experience with war." The students began gathering their materials, each processing what they had learned in their own way. Ji-Yun's 4 eyes continued to study the battlefield hologram until it finally faded away, while Dong Hyun's crystalline form showed complex patterns of contemplation. They had begun to understand that human history, though often violent, held crucial lessons about the cost and value of peace. The usual chatter and movement in the lecture hall died away as Professor Ta-Won's scales shifted to a deep indigo. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the evolution of human gunpowder weapons. Min-ji, who normally filled the classroom with her crystalline chimes of questions and comments, sat in complete silence, her normally bright form dimmed with shock. "What you are about to witness," Professor Ta-Won began, his voice carrying a note of gravity that made several students' environmental systems fluctuate, "marks one of the most significant turning points in human military history." The first hologram showed a primitive metal tube mounted on a wooden stock. This, he explained, was one of the earliest firearms. Humans discovered that certain mineral compounds, when ignited, could launch projectiles at incredible speeds. Min-ji's crystalline structure clouded slightly as she watched the demonstration. The hologram showed the weapon being loaded, the explosion of powder, and the deadly path of the projectile. Several other students emitted various signs of distress. A Jovian student's gaseous form condensed noticeably, while an energy being from Sirius flickered erratically. "These weapons," Ta-Won continued, his scales rippling with educational patterns, "revolutionized warfare on Earth. While our civilizations developed force fields and energy weapons, humans perfected the art of projecting small metal objects at lethal velocities." Hyunwoo, his atmospheric tentacles swirling with concern, raised one appendage. Were there no peaceful species on Earth to prevent this development? Professor Ta-Won's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. Earth developed only one sentient species, humans. They had no external influence to guide their technological development. Everything they created through their own experimentation and innovation. A hologram changed to show the progression of firearms through human history. Each new weapon was more sophisticated than the last, showing improvements in accuracy, rate of fire, and destructive power. "Notice," the professor pointed out, "how quickly these weapons evolved once the basic principle was understood. Humans moved from simple tubes that could fire once per minute to weapons that could fire hundreds of times in the same period." Min-ji finally found her voice, though her usual musical tones were subdued. Professor, how did they handle the psychological impact of creating such efficient killing tools? An excellent question. Todwan replied, his scales brightening slightly. Humans developed complex moral and ethical frameworks to govern the use of these weapons. They created rules of warfare, international laws, and concepts like arms control. The hologram shifted again, showing larger weapons mounted on vehicles and ships. Several students emitted involuntary distress signals at the sight of what the professor identified as artillery. These weapons, he explained, could launch projectiles over great distances, allowing humans to engage in combat without seeing their opponents. This created new psychological challenges and new ethical questions. A student from the methane oceans of Neptune raised a bubble-forming appendage. But Professor, surely they realized the destructive potential. Why continue developing more powerful weapons? Taiwan's scales shifted through several thoughtful patterns before he responded. Humans followed a principle they called deterrence. The idea was that having powerful weapons would actually prevent warfare, as no one would risk using them. The hologram now showed the increasing industrialization of human warfare, factories producing weapons, trains transporting armies, and the emergence of mechanized combat vehicles. This period, the professor continued, was called the Industrial Revolution. It changed not just how humans fought, but how they organized their entire society around the potential for warfare. Minji's crystalline form had begun to show patterns of deep thought rather than just shock. It seems almost paradoxical, she observed, creating more efficient ways to fight in hopes of preventing fighting altogether. Indeed, Taiwan agreed, his scales showing approval at her insight. This paradox became a central feature of human military development. They continued to create more powerful weapons while simultaneously working to ensure they would never be used. The hologram displayed a timeline of human weapons development, showing the accelerating pace of innovation. Several students emitted various signs of amazement at the speed of technological progress. What you're seeing, the professor explained, is how warfare drove human innovation. Many technologies we take for granted today, including several components of this very hologram system, were first developed for military purposes. Hyunwoo's atmospheric tentacles formed complex patterns indicating deep thought, so their violent tendencies actually accelerated their technological development. Could this explain their rapid advancement compared to other species? Professor Taiwan's scales shifted to a teaching pattern. That's one theory many historians support. Human warfare, despite its horrific nature, pushed them to innovate in ways peaceful species often did not. As the class session neared its end, the professor brought up one final hologram, a comparison of early human weapons with their modern counterparts. Before our next class, he said, consider this. Humans managed to advance from simple gunpowder weapons to space travel in just a few centuries. Their drive to create better weapons also led to better computers, better materials, better medical knowledge. Minji's crystalline form had finally returned to its normal brightness, though now it showed complex patterns of contemplation rather than her usual excitement. Perhaps, she said softly, we should be grateful that humans channeled their violent tendencies into innovation rather than pure destruction. Professor Taiwan's scales shifted to a pattern indicating both agreement and warning. That's an important insight, he replied. But remember, next class we'll discuss how these same innovations led to weapons so powerful that humans had to fundamentally rethink their approach to warfare. As the students began to leave, their various biological systems still processing what they had learned, the professor's final words hung in the air. Sometimes, the most important innovations come from our darkest impulses, but what matters most is how we choose to use them. The atmosphere in the lecture hall grew heavy as Professor Taiwan's scales shifted to a deep, somber blue. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the holographic display initialized, showing scenes from what humans called the Great War. What you are about to witness, the professor began, his voice carrying unusual gravity, represents the largest conflicts in human history prior to their space age. As the first images of trench warfare appeared, 3 students immediately requested permission to leave. A crystalline being from Rigel 7 had already clouded over completely. Their usual transparency turned to a foggy white of distress. Junseo, a gaseous entity, condensed so rapidly that their environmental containment unit had to adjust its pressure settings. This period of human history, Taiwan continued, his scales rippling with educational patterns tinged with solemnity, was known as the World Wars. For the first time in their history, nearly their entire planet became involved in armed conflict. The hologram showed lines of trenches stretching across landscapes, humans living in mud and water, facing weapons that could strike from miles away. Junseo's gaseous form swirled with obvious distress as the images played. "Observe," the professor said, manipulating the display, "how humans adapted to these new conditions. They developed machines specifically for crossing trenches, early aircraft for fighting in the sky, and weapons that could strike from beyond visual range." "Correct," Taiwan replied, his scales showing approval at the observation. The World Wars marked humanity's first truly three-dimensional conflicts. They even began fighting beneath the ocean's surface. The hologram shifted to show massive naval battles, with ships and submarines engaging across vast distances. Several more students requested permission to leave the classroom, their various biological systems struggling to process the scale of destruction. Yeonji, a bioluminescent student who had maintained her composure, raised her hand. How did they recover from such devastation? Her skin pulsed with curious patterns of light as she asked. Professor Taiwan's scales shifted to a complex pattern indicating both sorrow and admiration. Human resilience proved remarkable. After each global conflict, they rebuilt their cities, restored their environments, and even created international organizations to prevent future wars. The hologram now showed the progression of military technology during these conflicts. Tanks replaced horses, aircraft became more sophisticated, and communication systems evolved rapidly. "Notice," the professor pointed out, "how quickly human technology advanced during these wars. Many of their most significant innovations came from this period of intense conflict." Junseo, having finally stabilized their gaseous form, formed words through their translator. But the psychological cost. How did their species survive such trauma? Humans developed various coping mechanisms, Taiwan explained. They created art, literature, and music about their experiences. They built memorials to remember their losses. Most importantly, they used these experiences to fuel their desire for peace. The hologram displayed scenes of reconstruction after the wars. Cities rising from ruins, new international cooperation, and the beginnings of global communication networks. "What you're seeing," the professor continued, "is humanity's remarkable ability to rebuild and adapt. They took the technologies developed for war and found peaceful applications for them." A student from the energy clouds of Betelgeuse flickered with curiosity. "Is this why humans are so adamant about maintaining galactic peace now? Because they remember these conflicts?" Taiwan's scales showed approval at the insight. "Exactly. Humans learned from these devastating experiences. They realized that as their weapons became more powerful, war became too costly to contemplate." The hologram shifted to show the formation of the United Nations and other peacekeeping organizations. These institutions, the professor explained, were direct responses to the world wars. Humans created systems specifically designed to prevent such conflicts from happening again. Eunji's bioluminescence patterns shifted to show deep thought. So they needed to experience the worst of warfare to truly understand the value of peace. "In many ways, yes," Taiwan replied, his scales showing a complex mixture of emotions. The world wars marked a turning point in human history. They demonstrated both humanity's capacity for destruction and their ability to learn from their mistakes. The professor brought up one final holographic sequence, showing the progression from post-war reconstruction to the early space age. "Before our next class," he said, "consider this. Humans went from fighting in trenches to launching their first space vehicles in less than 50 years. Junseo, their gaseous form now showing patterns of contemplation rather than distress, asked through their translator, "Is this why humans adapted so quickly to joining the galactic community?" Because they had already learned the importance of cooperation through these conflicts. Professor Tawan's scales shifted to a teaching pattern. That's a profound observation. Humans brought with them not just their technology and resilience, but also their hard-won understanding of war's true cost. As the class session drew to a close, the remaining students began gathering their materials, each processing what they had learned in their own way. Yunji's bioluminescence had settled into thoughtful patterns, while Junseo's gaseous form showed signs of deep reflection. "Remember," the professor said as they prepared to leave, "understanding these conflicts helps us understand why humans are such strong advocates for galactic peace. They know, better than most species, exactly what is at stake." Professor Tawan's scales glimmered with a mixture of colors as he prepared to address one of the most complex aspects of human military history. The classroom's holographic display showed a timeline of human technological advancement, with key innovations highlighted in bright points of light. "What you must understand," Professor Tawan explained, his scales shifting to a deep educational pattern, "is that these conflicts, while devastating, drove human innovation at an unprecedented rate. Each war pushed their technology forward by decades." Sang-min, a crystalline being who had remained thoughtfully quiet throughout most of the course, finally raised an appendage. Light refracted through their transparent form as they spoke. "Is this why humans advanced so quickly compared to other species?" The professor's scales rippled in agreement. Their constant competition and conflict forced rapid adaptation and technological development. What took other species centuries of gradual progress, humans achieved in mere decades. The hologram shifted to show various human innovations: aircraft, computers, medical technologies, space vehicles. Each display was tagged with both its military origins and its peaceful applications. "Observe," Taiwan continued, manipulating the display, "how many everyday technologies began as military developments. Human spacecraft evolved from weapons delivery systems. Their global communication network started as a military project. Even their medical advancement was accelerated by the need to treat combat injuries." A student from the methane seas of Neptune raised a bubbling appendage. "But professor, couldn't they have achieved the same progress through peaceful means?" Taiwan's scales shifted to a contemplative blue. "That's a question many historians still debate. What we know is that human warfare created urgent needs that required immediate solutions. This urgency drove innovation faster than peaceful research alone might have." The hologram now showed the progression of human space technology, from primitive rockets to modern starships. Sang-min's crystalline form sparkled with interest as they studied the display. "Notice," the professor pointed out, "how quickly humans moved from atmospheric flight to space travel. Their first powered flight and their first moon landing were separated by less than 70 Earth years. A silicate being from Proxima raised their geometric appendage. But surely such rapid advancement came with risks. Did they not worry about developing technology too quickly?" Professor Tawan's scales showed approval at the question. "Indeed they did. Humans created entire fields of study dedicated to the ethical implications of their technological advancement. They learned to balance progress with safety." The hologram switched to show modern human society, with its mixture of military and civilian technologies working together. Several students emitted various signs of amazement at the seamless integration. "What you're seeing," Taiwan explained, "is how humans transformed their military innovations into peaceful applications. Their destructive knowledge became constructive power." Sang-min's crystalline form showed complex patterns of thought as they processed this information. So their violent past actually prepared them better for peaceful cooperation. It seems paradoxical. Many aspects of human history appear paradoxical to other species, the professor agreed, his scales showing a pattern of scholarly appreciation. Their greatest achievements often arose from their darkest moments. The hologram displayed a comparison between early human weapons and modern human medical equipment, showing how military technology had evolved into life-saving tools. Consider this, Taiwan continued. Humans took the same principles they used to understand explosions and used them to develop energy production. They turned their knowledge of projectiles into space exploration tools. A gaseous student from the outer rings of Saturn expanded thoughtfully. Is this why humans are so valued in the galactic community? Because they can see both the destructive and constructive potential in everything. The professor's scales brightened. Exactly. Humans bring a unique perspective to galactic society. They understand both the cost of conflict and the value of peace in ways few other species can comprehend. Sang-Nin spoke again, their crystalline form now showing patterns of deep understanding. And this is why they are such strong advocates for controlled technological development. Because they know the dangers firsthand. Precisely, Taiwan replied. Humans learn their lessons through experience, often painful experience. They now use that knowledge to help guide other species' development. The hologram showed a final sequence, the progression from human warfare to human participation in galactic peacekeeping missions. The contrast was striking, even to students who had studied human history throughout the course. Before our next class, the professor said, his scales shifting to a serious deep blue. Consider this. Humans managed to transform themselves from a species divided by warfare into one of the galaxy's strongest advocates for peace. Their history of conflict became a foundation for understanding cooperation. As the students prepared to leave, Sang-Min's crystalline form showed one final pattern of curiosity. Professor, do you think other species could have developed as quickly without experiencing conflict? Taiwan's scales shifted through several thoughtful patterns before he responded. That's a question we may never be able to answer. What we do know is that human history, despite its violence, produced a species uniquely qualified to help maintain galactic peace. The students filed out of the classroom, their various biological systems processing what they had learned. Each had gained a new appreciation for how humanity's difficult past had shaped their current role in the galaxy. Even those who had been initially horrified by human warfare now understood how those same experiences had created a species dedicated to preventing such conflicts from ever occurring again. As the final lecture session began, Professor Taiwan's scales shimmered with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. He looked across the classroom at his students, noting how their reactions to human military history had evolved over the course. What had begun as horror and revulsion had transformed into something far more complex, a deep appreciation for human resilience and adaptability. The holographic display showed a montage of everything they had covered, from primitive warfare to modern space combat doctrine. Each image now drew thoughtful responses rather than the shock and disgust that had marked their early classes. As we conclude our study of Earth's military history, Taiwan began, his scales shifting to a rich gold of academic achievement. I want you all to reflect on how your understanding has changed since our first class. A ripple of movement passed through the classroom as various species indicated their agreement. Even the methane-breathing students in their environmental chambers showed signs of acknowledgement through their atmospheric patterns. Remember, he continued, understanding Earth's military history isn't about judging their methods, but comprehending how they shaped human civilization. Each conflict, each innovation, each horror and triumph, all of it contributed to creating the species we know today. Jayan, the crystalline class representative whose form had grown notably clearer and more complex throughout the course, rose from their position. Light refracted through their body in patterns indicating deep respect as they spoke. I think I speak for everyone, they said, their translator conveying the gravity in their harmonic tones, when I say we'll never look at human diplomatic representatives the same way again. We understand now that their commitment to peace comes from a deep, personal understanding of war's cost. The professor's scales rippled with approval. That, students, was precisely the point of these lessons. Humans aren't just another species that developed space travel. They are survivors who learned from their mistakes and chose to use their hard-won knowledge to benefit others. A student from the gas clouds of Jupiter expanded thoughtfully. Their history explains so much about their behavior in the Galactic Council, why they always push for diplomatic solutions, yet maintain such powerful defensive capabilities. Exactly, Ta-1 agreed, his scales showing patterns of scholarly satisfaction. Humans understand better than most that peace must be actively maintained. Their history taught them that preparation prevents conflict. A hologram shifted through a final sequence, showing human diplomatic missions throughout the galaxy. The images highlighted how humans had transformed their military expertise into peacekeeping skills. Consider, the professor continued, how humans apply their military experience to benefit galactic society. Their strategic thinking helps plan trade routes. Their defensive knowledge protects shipping lanes. Their understanding of conflict resolution prevents interplanetary disputes. A bioluminescent student pulsed with curious light patterns. Professor, would you say that humanity's violent past actually made them better peacekeepers? Tai-1's scales shifted through complex patterns of thought before he responded. In many ways, yes. Their experiences taught them to value peace while understanding the complexity of maintaining it. They know the price of failure. Jayan's crystalline form sparkled as they added, and they shared these lessons with us, without requiring us to learn them the hard way. Precisely, the professor agreed, his scales brightening. This is perhaps humanity's greatest contribution to galactic society, sharing their hard-won wisdom so others don't have to repeat their mistakes. As the final class session drew to a close, Professor Ta-1 adjusted the hologram one last time, showing an image of Earth alongside various alien worlds. "Look at how far they've come," he said softly. "From tribal warfare to galactic peacekeepers in just a few thousand years." The students began gathering their materials, but none showed the usual rush to leave. Instead, they lingered, their various biological systems showing signs of deep contemplation. Some discussed among themselves how their view of humans had changed, while others sat in thoughtful silence. "Before you go," Ta-1 said, his scales shifting to a formal academic pattern, "remember this. Humanity's greatest strength isn't their military prowess or their technological innovation. It's their ability to learn from their past and choose a different future." Jayan remained behind as the others filed out. Their crystalline form showed patterns of deep appreciation as they addressed the professor one final time. "Thank you for helping us understand. I used to fear humans' capacity for violence. Now I understand that it's precisely that capacity, and their choice to control it, that makes them such valuable allies." Professor Ta-1's scales rippled with satisfaction as he watched his last student leave. The course had achieved its goal, not just teaching the facts of human military history, but helping a new generation of galactic citizens understand their most paradoxical allies, a species that had mastered the art of war, only to become the galaxy's most dedicated architects of peace. As he shut down the holographic display for the final time, he reflected that perhaps this was the most important lesson of all, that understanding someone's past was key to appreciating their present, and crucial to building a shared future.